Welcome to the Riverside Times, a continuing narrative of old Chesaning. Issue number 1. We begin this issue with some winter scenes from around the turn of the last century. Out for a ride in their cutter, Edward and Eliza Waldron reined in their horse for a photographer, right on the curve of the boulevard. Eliza, dressed against the chill, wears a beaver cape and hat, and carries a beaver muff. Notice the sleigh bells encircling the horse. Skating on the river appealed to all ages. This group paused for the camera in front of where the showboat once wintered. Behind them is the old east side of town. Chesaning sprang up originally on the east side of the river, but slowly migrated across the bridge, lured away from the river by the railroad. Winter-slick roads made it possible to move mammoth loads of logs from the woods to the mills. The man at the right probably has bought these logs. Now let's hear some personal recollections from a few of our earliest pioneers. Presented here is a letter written by Eliza Ann Allen in 1896. In it, she tells the story of how her family, and the George Chapman family, made the journey from Massachusetts to the wilds of Chesaning, then called Northampton, in 1842, when she was still only 15 years old. The two families settled here, became leading citizens, and Eliza Ann became the first village school teacher. But first came this journey.
We left Massachusetts, George Chapman and family, and my father, William Smith and family, on October 10, 1842, all meeting in Springfield about noon, and the same day taking train for Albany, leaving many near and dear ones for the unknown wilds of Michigan. We stayed the first night at Greenbush, where we were to take the canal boat, leaving about 4 o'clock next day. Our journey through New York, although slow, was not tedious, and time passed very pleasantly. There were some very nice people on the boat who joined our party at Springfield. We became quite well acquainted and parted with much regret. We arrived in Buffalo Wednesday morning, October 19th, and took the steamboat for Detroit. The lake was rough and stormy. All were sick. We ran onto a sandbar at Cleveland and stayed till the next day about 3, when we started again for Detroit, arriving there Friday afternoon, the 21st, about 7 o'clock. We went to what was then called the Temperance House, a 2-story building without finish, outside or in. From there we could see most all of Detroit. It was not very inviting. It was the muddiest, dirtiest place I ever saw. I do not remember to have seen a school building or a church, not much like the beautiful Detroit of today. Saturday, about 4 o'clock, we left Detroit, 27 of us, all in one wagon. They said it was the largest load that had ever left there. Our journey that night was fearfully unpleasant. It was very dark and all thick woods. The roads were log and mud. The horses walked every step of the way from Detroit to Royal Oak. We came to a stop about 9 o'clock, found it comfortable and homelike and a good table. There I had my first taste of mashed potatoes. They were really very nice. The next morning, although it was Sunday, we were early on the road. We met and passed many on their way to and from their places of worship. I saw no churches, and most of the buildings were made of logs. We stopped Sunday night at BB's Tavern. The next morning, it snowed. Our first snowstorm in Michigan, snowed all day. Tuesday, we were on the road again, and with so much snow, it was slow traveling. At 9 o'clock in the evening, we stopped at a house tavern, or private house, I know not which. All I can say, the beds were all in one room on the ground floor, with thin curtains between and around them. I thought it would be impossible to sleep in such a room as that. It was a very cold night. Cold and fatigue conquered. I slept. Wednesday the 26th, Mr. Hartwell, the man who brought us from Detroit, stopped at his own house on the Grand River Road. Here we found it nice and a good table. Thursday, October 27th, Mr. Hartwell brought Mr. Chapman and father to Owasso. He said the road was so poor he would not drive through with his own horses. The next day, Mr. Hartwell brought us as far as Rush, where we were met by Mr. Chapman and father. That night, October 29th, we landed in Chesaning, 6 days' journey from Royal Oak. what would a 6 days journey be now? We came on the bank of the river just opposite my brother William Smith's place, soon after candlelight. From there down the river we could see lights flashing, moving about as though there was a large village, but it was too dark to discern one object from another. We were obliged to wait 9 long hours. Then the sun came out, and in place of thick woods, as I had supposed would be, the beautiful Shiawassee River met my view, with flats and riverbanks cleared. It was indeed a surprise, and with so many lovely places along the high banks, one could not very well be homesick.
Sarah Whipple, the youngest sister of Mrs. George Chapman, was 24 years old when she came west. Half a century later, she recalled her early experiences in a letter written for the Chesaning Pioneer Picnic of 1896. She had married James Fuller in 1847, but as her memories clearly show, life was not easy.
When I came to Michigan, I had little idea of the wilderness confronting us. True, we had had reports of the western country, but as the Queen of Sheba said, the half had not been told. Arriving at Detroit, we stayed overnight. Mr. Chapman led us to a temperance hotel. At the hotel, the tablecloth used on the table was taken from the washtub, wrung out as dry as possible, and placed on the table. Settlers were coming in so fast that they could not keep enough dry linen to use. The next morning, we started overland with 2 teams and wagons. On the way from Detroit, we were obliged to ford a stream, which none of us had ever seen done, and which frightened the women somewhat. I well remember Mrs. William Smith saying, upon our getting through all right, "Well, if I had known we would have to do that, I would never have started from Michigan." The teams brought us as far as Hartwell's Hotel, about 6 miles south of Owasso, on the Grand River Road. On reaching there, one team went back to Detroit. Leaving our goods there, we came on with one team. When we reached Owasso, we found a small hotel, one dry goods store, flouring mill, and few other places of business. It was not nearly as large as Oakley now is, and brush was growing in all the streets, except for a short distance on Main Street. About 5 miles this side of Owasso, we came to a settler's log cabin, and the woman of the house hailed us, asking where we were going. "To Northampton," Chesaning's first name. "Oh," said she, "down to Indiantown." She then told us to be very careful on account of the rough roads, as a young lady had been killed a few days before by being thrown from a wagon. The road was so full of stumps that we had to drive very carefully and hold on to the wagon box. We met a man who told us that between that place and here there was a swamp which held 1,000 wolves. We did not find the wolves as he said, but from their howlings at night we could imagine that he had made a very low estimate of their number. We reached here without accident. Arriving here in the fall, we were not introduced to the Michigan mosquito at once, but the next spring they made up for the lateness of our acquaintance and nearly drove us out of the country. All the stock ran in the woods and browsed during the winter. I think Mr. Chapman's horse only came up twice during the whole winter. Where my present home is, there was nothing but an Indian trail for years. One evening I was walking down by the river with my husband, and being startled by some noise in the high weeds, and asking the cause of it, he replied that it was wild turkeys which nested there. None of us knew at that time that they were eatable. Mr. Whaley, one of the settlers, had a couple of hogs weighing 150 pounds in a pen near the house, and during one night a Bruin walked off with one, and he was obliged to board the pen over to save the other one. It was a common thing to see a wild cat walking away from the hen coop in the early morning after doing his best all night to get in. What a change between then and now. The first few years of hardship I do not care to live over. I remember when we were in the hotel on the west side of the river. Upwards of 40 to 50 teams put up there at night, and myself and one girl did all the work. Teams came from as far as Ann Arbor for lumber. Perhaps the hard trails and privations of that pioneer life have been but for good, as I now find myself at 78 years in good health, never having worn glasses and having no need for them now, and determined to enjoy the balance of my life as much as possible.
We conclude this issue of the Riverside Times with the recollections of Lloyd Kettler, a lifelong resident of Chesaning. In his mind's eye, he is standing again on the high riverbank of his family's farm, watching a curious boat passing by below. Between 1906 and 1913, he remembers thinking how hard they worked for so little.
It was a scow, maybe 12 feet wide and 25 feet long, with square ends, not pointed, and it was being poled upriver by a man and his son. Over and over again, standing at the bow, they shoved their poles into the river bottom, and then, leaning heavily upon them, they slowly walked to the back of the boat. They literally powered the boat by walking.
The pair's labored destination was one of several spots in the river below the Catholic cemetery where, in exchange for back-breaking labor, the river yielded up choice gravel, for William Houghton and his son Vern were in the gravel business.
They got good clean gravel from the river. It was free of clay, just nice sand and little pebbles. And of course later it was sifted to remove the pebbles because what the Houghton sold was gravel for masonry work.
To claim the gravel from the river involved the use of a system of pulleys and cable attached to a scoop and mounted on the boat on a tall upright post. The whole thing could swing out over the water, and the scoop would be lowered into the river. With great effort, a large crank was turned to lift the loaded scoop. It was then swung over the scow, and the load dumped directly on the deck. William and Vern would slowly build a ridge of gravel 4 or 5 feet high, taking care to center it so the scow would not capsize. When the boat was loaded, they again took up their poles and once more began their river walk.
They were always walking backwards. If the boat were headed downstream, then they were walking the other way, leaning heavily into it. In this manner, they finally arrived at a dock just under the bridge in what is now Cole Park. Here they unloaded the gravel, using the planks to run wheelbarrows on and off the boat. I often thought, what a small amount of gravel for such a lot of work.
They had, he estimates today, maybe 5 or 10 cubic yards of gravel, but it was fine gravel, and it was sold to local masons who, after careful sifting, used the sand that was left to mix the mortar that still today holds together many of the old brick buildings in Chesaning. William and Vern Houghton had made their contribution to the growth of Chesaning. The Riverside Times is a production of the Chesaning Area Historical Society. Please visit us at chesaninghistory.org for more information.